Tribal Viets inhabiting the Red River Delta entered written history when China's southward expansion reached them in the 3rd century BCE. From that time onward, a dominant theme of Vietnam's history has been interaction with China, the source of most of Vietnam's high culture. As a tribute-paying state after throwing off Chinese rule in 938 CE, Vietnam sent lacquerware, animal skins, ivory, and tropical products to the Chinese emperor and received scrolls on philosophy, administration, and literature in return. Sinic culture seeped deeply into society, but it shaped the aristocracy and mandarinal families more than it did the peasantry, which preserved distinctive customs, beliefs, vocabulary, lifeways, and gender relations. Modeling themselves on Chinese emperors, Vietnam's kings exacted tribute from ethnic minorities on the periphery of the Vietnamese state and called themselves emperors when not addressing the Chinese court. Although cultural and spatial gaps between the Vietnamese court and the farthest reaches of society were not as great as they were in China, Vietnam is about the size of a Chinese province, with a comparable population. The Vietnamese state's capacity to rule diminished with distance from the capital. The refractory character of bamboo-hedged peasant communes was captured in the cliché, "The emperor's writ stops at the village gate." Vietnam has a long history of affiliating with a dominant civilization and adapting that civilization's ideas, institutions, and technology to Vietnamese purposes. This pattern of affiliating and adapting was already evident in Vietnam's historical relations with China, and it reappeared as descendants of Mandarins responded to the challenge of the West by rejecting tradition and becoming communists to combat colonialism. The pattern was evident again as it animated 20th-century artistic movements that employed Western forms to promote social renovation, and since the 1980s it has been the driving force behind the Vietnam Communist Party's embrace of economic liberalization and integration into the world economy. Such strategic absorption and adaptation have helped propel Vietnam to become one of the world's most populous countries, with one of the most rapidly expanding market economies. The capital, Hanoi, is located in the north, while the country's largest city, Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, is in the south. Vietnam experienced a period of prolonged warfare in the mid-20th century, and a partitioning, 1954–75, first militarily and later politically, into the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, better known as North Vietnam, and the Republic of Vietnam, usually called South Vietnam. Following reunification in April 1975, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was established in July 1976. With an area and configuration similar to those of Norway, Vietnam extends about 1,025 miles from north to south and is about 30 miles wide east to west at its narrowest part. It is bordered by China to the north, the South China Sea to the east and south, the Gulf of Siam, Thailand to the southwest, and Cambodia and Laos to the west. Vietnam's principal physiographic features are the Annamese Cordillera, extending generally from northwest to southeast in central Vietnam and dominating the interior, and two extensive alluvial deltas formed by the Red River in the north and the Mekong River in the south. Between these two deltas is a long, relatively narrow coastal plain, climate of Vietnam. The northern part of Vietnam is on the edge of the tropical climatic zone. During January, the coldest month of the year, Hanoi has a mean temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, while the annual average temperature is 23 degrees Celsius. Farther south, the average annual temperature in Hue is 25 degrees Celsius and in Ho Chi Minh City is 27 degrees Celsius. In the highland city of Dalat, it drops to 70 degrees Fahrenheit 21 degrees Celsius. The winter season in northern Vietnam lasts from November to April. From early February to the end of March there is a persistent drizzle, and March and April are sometimes considered to be a transitional period. The summer in northern Vietnam lasts from April or May to October and is characterized by heat, heavy rainfall. and occasional typhoons. In central and southern Vietnam, the southwest monsoon winds between June and November bring rains and typhoons to the eastern slopes of the mountains and the lowland plains. The period between December and April is drier and is characterized by the winds of the northeast monsoon and, in the south, by high temperatures. Diverse cultural traditions, geographies, and historical events have created distinct regions within the country. The lowlands generally have been occupied by ethnic Vietnamese, while the highlands have been home to numerous smaller ethnic groups that differ culturally and linguistically from the Vietnamese. The highland peoples can be divided into the northern ethnic groups, who have affinities with peoples in southern China, and the southern highland populations, who have ties with peoples in Cambodia, and peoples in Indonesia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. A north-south variation has also emerged among the ethnic Vietnamese as they have expanded southward from the Red River Delta along the coastal plain and into the Mekong Delta. The Vietnamese have long made a distinction between the northern region, with Hanoi as its cultural center, the central region, where the Nguyen dynasty established a capital at Hue, and the southern region, with Ho Chi Minh City as its urban center. Vietnam has one of the most complex ethno-linguistic patterns in Asia. The Vietnamese majority was significantly Sinicized during a millennium of Chinese rule, which ended in 939 CE. Indian influence is most evident among the Cham and Khmer minorities. The Cham formed the majority population in the Indianized kingdom of Kampa in what is now central Vietnam from the 2nd to the late 15th century. Small numbers of Cham remain in the south-central coastal plain and in the Mekong Delta near the Cambodian border. Many other ethnic groups inhabit the highlands and cultures vary considerably in the central region. Shared characteristics include a way of life still largely oriented toward kin groups and small communities. These Central Highlanders have affinities with other Southeast Asians and have exhibited an intense desire to preserve their own cultural identities. In the northern uplands, the various groups have ethno-linguistic affiliations with peoples in Thailand, Laos, and southern China. Vietnam is one of the fastest-growing countries in the world, and its economy has shown resilience to trade wars and slower growth rates in neighboring China. This accelerated economic pace is due to labor shifting from agriculture to manufacturing and services, private investment, a strong tourist sector, higher wages, and accelerating urbanization. Exports constitute an increasingly significant contribution to Vietnam's GDP, and certain sectors such as industrial production, textiles, electronics, and seafood production have been growing rapidly. In the first 9 months of 2024, Vietnam's gross domestic product, GDP, increased by 6.82% year-on-year, with a GDP growth rate of 7.4% in the third quarter. The socio-economic situation in the third quarter and the first 9 months of the year continues to show positive trends, with various sectors gaining significant achievements, laying a foundation for further growth in the remainder of the year. According to IMF forecasts, GDP growth in Vietnam is expected to pick up to 5.8% this year and 6.9% in 2025. The General Statistics Office reported that Vietnam's Consumer Price Index for 9 months 2024 increased by 3.88% year-on-year, aligning with the target established by the National Assembly. Employed population aged 15 years of age and above is around 51.4 million people. General unemployment rate is 2.26%, underemployment rate of labor force at working age is 1.99%. The average monthly wage is around 7.6 million VND or equivalent to $300. Total investment of first 9 months 2024 is 2,417 trillion VND or equivalent to $96 million or increasing by 6.8%. The trade surplus is positive $20.79 billion. The politics of Vietnam is dominated by a single party under an authoritarian system, the Communist Party of Vietnam, CPV. The President of Vietnam is the head of state, and the Prime Minister of Vietnam is the head of government. Both of these offices are separate from the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, who leads the CPV and is head of the Politburo and the Central Military Commission. The General Secretary is thus the de facto highest position in the Vietnamese politics. Executive power is exercised by the government and the President of Vietnam. Legislative power is vested in the National Assembly of Vietnam. The judiciary is independent of the executive. The National Congress is the party's highest organ. The direction of the party and the government is decided at the National Congress, held every 5th year. The Central Committee is elected by the National Congress. Delegates vote on policies and candidate posts within the Central Party leadership. Following ratification of the decisions taken at the National Congress, the National Congress dissolves itself. The Central Committee, which is elected by the National Congress every 5th year, implements the decisions of the National Congress in the 5-year period. Since the Central Committee only meets twice a year, the Politburo implements the policies of the National Congress. The Central Committee, CC, is the CPV's most powerful institution. It delegates some of its powers to the Secretariat and the Politburo when it is not in session. The Central Committee elects the Politburo in the aftermath of the Party Congress. Since the full Central Committee meets only once a year, the Politburo functions as the party's leading collective decision-making body. The Secretariat is also elected by the Central Committee, and is headed by the General Secretary. It is responsible for solving organizational problems and implementing the demands of the Central Committee. The Secretariat oversees the work of the commissions of the Central Committee. The General Secretary is the de facto leader of Vietnam. The National Assembly is a rubber-stamp unicameral legislative body. The National Assembly has 500 members, indirectly elected by popular vote to serve 5-year terms. The legislature is, according to the Constitution, the highest organ of the state. Its powers includes the enactment and amendment of the Constitution and laws, the adoption of the government budget, supervising the government of Vietnam and other holders of public powers responsible to the National Assembly, and appointing members of the judiciary. The Vietnamese constitution and legislation provides for regular elections for the office of the President of the Socialist Republic, the National Assembly and the People's Councils. The Assembly appoints, the President, head of state, the Prime Minister, head of government, the Chief Justice of the Supreme People's Court, the head of the Supreme People's Procuracy, the General State Auditor, and approval of the members' government such as Deputy Prime Ministers, Department Ministers. As recommendation of the President and the Prime Minister. The President is elected by National Assembly for a 5-year term and acts as the de jure Commander-in-Chief of the Vietnam People's Armed Forces and Chairman of the Council for Defense and Security. However, the President has the right to decide on executive brands. The government, the main executive state power of Vietnam, is headed by the Prime Minister, who has several Deputy Prime Ministers and several ministers in charge of particular activities. The executive branch is responsible for the implementation of political, economic, cultural, social, national defense, security and external activities of the state. Vietnam has a judicial system governed by the Constitution of Vietnam and national legislation enacted by National Assembly. The Supreme People's Court is the highest court of appeal in Vietnam. There are other specialized courts in Vietnam, including the Central Military Court, the Criminal Court, the Civil Court and the Appeal Court. The Supreme People's Procuracy observes the implementation of state organs and makes sure that Vietnamese citizens follow the law. Vietnamese culture values emphasize respect for family, harmony in community relationships, and humility in personal conduct. These values are rooted in Confucianism and permeate daily life, influencing everything from social interactions to business practices in Vietnam. Vietnam's culture blends traditions influenced by Chinese and Western cultures, alongside a mix of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, collectively known as Tam Giao in Vietnamese language. The official language is Vietnamese, which has 6 different tones, making it a tonal language. Writing system. The Vietnamese writing system uses the Latin alphabet with additional diacritics. Family structure. Family is the cornerstone of Vietnamese society. Extended families often live together, and respect for elders is paramount. Ancestor worship. Many Vietnamese people practice ancestor worship, believing that deceased family members continue to influence the living. The Ao Dai is the traditional Vietnamese dress, known for its elegance. It is worn by both men and women, especially on formal occasions. Tet Nguyen Dan, the Vietnamese New Year, or Tet, is the most important festival in Vietnam. It marks the arrival of spring and is celebrated with various customs, such as cleaning the house, paying off debts, and cooking special foods. Mid-Autumn Festival, celebrated on the 15th day of the 8th lunar month. This festival involves mooncakes and lantern processions, especially popular with children. Buddhism. The dominant religion in Vietnam is Buddhism, but there are also significant numbers of Catholics, Protestants, and followers of Chow Dai and Hoa Hao. Pho, a famous Vietnamese dish. Pho is a noodle soup consisting of broth, rice noodles, herbs, and meat, usually beef or chicken. Diverse ingredients. Vietnamese cuisine is known for its use of fresh herbs and vegetables, minimal use of dairy and oil, and reliance on rice and noodles as staples. Folk religion. Many Vietnamese practice a form of folk religion that includes elements of animism, ancestor worship, and the worship of deities and natural phenomena. Water puppetry, a traditional Vietnamese art form. Water puppetry dates back to the 11th century. It involves wooden puppets performing on water, depicting rural life and folklore. Literature. Vietnamese literature has a rich history, with notable contributions in both poetry and prose. Classic works often reflect themes of love, nature, and patriotism. Traditional music. Vietnamese traditional music includes various forms such as Ca Tru, Chio, and Quan Ho. Each region of Vietnam has its own distinct musical styles. Dance. Traditional Vietnamese dance often depicts historical events, myths, and daily life. The lion dance is particularly popular during the Tet Festival. Pagodas and temples. Vietnam is home to many ancient pagodas and temples, which are architectural marvels. These structures often have curved roofs, intricate carvings, and statues of deities.